25 years. And recently I decided I had gotten to a sort of critical mass in self-adult learning of learning theory. And so I decided that I was going to like deconstruct the way that I teach first-year contracts and make this more transparent. So the things that I'm working on that I haven't finished yet is to break apart the core of common law legal reasoning with task analysis and set up a clear learning progression so that the students have absolutely explicit scaffolding. So that's the problem that I've set for myself. Now, there's a whole problem of sort of semantics, like what we call different things. So at lunch, Deb and I were chatting, and we discovered that what I call the radioactive core of legal reasoning, she calls the chewy nougat. So, are we getting there? Is that like, do you have some idea what, so there's, oh, I know, I just got the Michael Hunter Schwartz book on teaching first-year contracts. You know, the Institute for Law Teaching and Learning now has a series of textbooks published by Carolina Academic Press. I should, before I go any further, I should just try and figure out who's in the room that I'm talking to. How many people are stand-up classroom teachers like me? I teach a traditional black letter law topic. How many people are in the skills part of the curriculum, like legal writing or clinic or something? Okay, how many people are librarians? How many people are law school tech support people? Okay, and is there anybody in a category that I didn't mention? I think those are the main groups that come to account.
Yeah, we're sort of other, we're consultants in assessment.
Wow, like we should exchange business cards. Like I suspect I can learn more from you than you're going to learn from me. Okay, so now, how many people in this room, because this is a tech room, how many people in this room know the significance of the kernel that Linus Torvalds contributed to the GNU project? How many people know what that is? Okay, how many people know who Richard Stallman is? Okay, a few people. Okay, so for those of you who feel puzzled about the reference to Richard Stallman and Linus Torvalds, Richard Stallman was a genius, and he had this huge, ambitious project to create a operating system, computer operating system in open source. And because of the depth and breadth of his ambition, he ran into some huge technological problems, and so they had completed most of the operating system, but then years were passing and it wasn't launching. And then like a 19-year-old in Finland, computer science undergraduate, wrote something that he calls the kernel, and it actually solved the problem that all of the sophisticated computer scientists in the United States working on Richard Stallman's project had been able to solve. So that's, in computer science, it's called the kernel of the GNU operating system. So people who are Richard Stallman supporters refer to it as GNU, and people who are Linus Torvalds supporters refer to it as Linux. Okay, are you familiar with? Okay, so anyway, so that's the idea, is that it's the thing at the center that makes all the other parts interoperate and work together. In the Law Teaching and Learning, in the Institute for Law Teaching and Learning contracts book from Michael Hunter Schwartz, he has a sort of like, you know, rules, facts, and then here's your conclusion, and he calls it a gap. So I'm saying that this is what's in the gap. And when faculty members grade issue spotter exams, there's the I'll know it when I see it. It's like, this student has crossed the gap correctly, and then as somebody else pointed out, that's why it's so subjective whether or not somebody's done that correctly. Okay, so that's the problem that I've set for myself. Okay, so the title of the talk, I chose evidence-based, and as far as I know, evidence-based is used in certain disciplines. It's widely used in healthcare. So evidence-based means you're continually collecting evidence and modifying what you're doing as you go along. As far as I know, evidence-based, they probably thought it up themselves in medicine, but I think the earlier instance is actually Edwards Deming. How many people know who Edwards Deming is? He's the guy that offered to help the folks in Detroit learn how to make quality automobiles in the 1950s, and they told him that Americans buy style, not quality, and so he went to Japan, and his system is called the Toyota Production System. Okay, so Edwards Deming was a quality engineer during World War II, and at the end of World War II, this cadre of quality engineers that had been working in procurement for the US military fanned out into American industry, and generally they met a very unreceptive audience. And a lot of them went to, Edwards Deming isn't the only one who went to Japan, and that's one of the reasons that Japanese industry is so different than American industry. Okay, so in industry, it's called total quality management if you don't want to get hung up on Toyota. In environmental law, it's called adaptive management. Do people know from environmental law? ISO 14000? Okay, so when I use the word evidence-based in my title, I was referring to a specific, it's also called continuous improvement. Okay, so at this point, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm going to throw this will be the first one where I just like throw it open for discussion. Is there anybody who's unclear on what I'm referring to here as it's a kind of knowledge management governance system. It's a problem-solving system. Okay? Can people think of other examples that I haven't written on the board from your own fields? Yes?
Six Sigma.
Six Sigma. Okay, so Six Sigma is a very, are you like an engineer?
In a former life.
Were you Six Sigma qualified?
No, I was not.
Okay, but you had friends who were.
I was a computer science professor for 8 years.
Okay, so Six Sigma was invented by Motorola, and it's like, I'm not good at the math. Can you explain what the Six Sigma technically refers to? It means...
No, I'm not gonna, it's been...
Okay, so you collect data and you do the regression analysis 6 times, and then you get down to like 0 or something. But the point is you're collecting data about whether or not you've achieved your engineering goal, and you run the analysis like 6 times.
It's total quality management. So when you're in an engineering school, they start out with the Toyota process, and they book to Six Sigma at the end. I mean, that's where they end up. So
yeah.
It's the process, and it becomes more data intensive and more routine and more organized and more mathematical.
Yes. Okay. So the best explanation I ever saw of that, what we're talking, because like I have a college degree in economics and I am not an engineer. Okay. So it's hard for me to understand all these engineering continuous improvement things. But somebody wrote a biography of Edwards Deming, a journalist wrote a biography, and in that biography was a diagram. And it said, in industrial processes, engineers have tolerances. So this could be, the upper tolerance could be 2, and this could be 1. And if the thing that they're producing is within the tolerances, then it meets quality control and it's delivered to the customer. And if it's outside the tolerances, it doesn't. Okay? So what the total quality management systems do is we'd say, okay, so this would represent, 1.5. So what you do is you're collecting data about where your products are coming in this spectrum of acceptable, and every time you evaluate, you go back and find out why you didn't hit the target, and you adjust the process so that over time, eventually, you get to where you are actually hitting the target 100% of the time. Okay? So the reason, for example, that you can have a mobile phone that's more powerful than the first personal computers we all bought back in the 1980s is because of vast improvements in the precision of manufacturing processes. You couldn't possibly get all that computer stuff working and interoperating if they hadn't radically improved the engineering of the physical manufacturing. Okay, so that's the goal. Now, you can't, it's data driven, right? And so you can't do any of this evidence-based continuous improvement process where everything is just like a momentary status check and we're open to changing things and we're open to improving things and we're open to renegotiating things unless you have data. Okay, so one of the things I did this year at the University of Washington is I tried to learn to write rubrics. So before I tell you that story, I can tell you a really hilarious story. So my research topic is e-commerce, and that used to be more fashionable than it is now. So if you have a really cool research topic, you can get invited to foreign countries. So I was teaching a short intensive course at Monash University in Victoria in Australia, and they're really, really, really into teaching effectiveness in Australia. It's like a national culture. And so Monash University sent me, I had to develop rubrics for every element of my syllabus, and it was it's like there's just not enough hours between now and when I'm going to start teaching the course. And she said, it's okay. And the registrar sent me somebody else's answers that I could cut and paste. Okay. So anyway, so all I'm saying is that there's ways to do rubrics and there's ways to do rubrics. So I've cut and pasted other people's rubrics, but I haven't actually written mine. Okay. So we have a center at University of Washington called the Center for Teaching and Learning. And I would write these things. I would look at these templates from K-12 education, And I would try and write rubrics, and I would go over and I would see the instructional designers, the people at the Center for Teaching and Learning, and show them and say, what you've written is very interesting, and I'm sure it's very helpful for your students, but it's not a rubric. So believe, do you know what I felt like? I felt like a first-year law student. Right? It's like, why? Why the template? Why is it not a rubric, right? So, has anybody else had that experience? Working with an instructional designer and trying to write a rubric and being told, that's really helpful feedback you're giving the students. That will help student learning, but you haven't technically hit the target, right? Okay, so slowly on this voyage of self-discovery, the conclusion that I came to is that it's this problem, it's the gap. That's the reason I can't write a rubric. It's because we haven't defined the educational objective with enough rigor. That a rubric helps assess whether or not you've hit the target. And in legal education, our description of the target is, and this is where again I'm at a loss for words, but I use words like complex, synthetic, aggregate. So the problem is that I listened to the discussion about SWORD, and our colleague, is he here? The colleague that presented about SWORD? I mean, it was a very interesting presentation. I learned a lot, but he was talking about legal writing, and the target, deliverable that they were focusing on was like a 5-page memo. And at the level of a 5-page memo, the rubrics that we write are way too abstract to help the students. And there's no consensus in legal education as you move down from like a 5-page legal writing memo to tighter and tighter activities. There isn't a consensus in legal education about how you talk about that core skill that we're assessing. Everybody see the problem? So as I kept hammering away at this problem, this is why I came to the conclusion that this is what I had to do. I had to start trying to pull apart the core elements of legal reasoning. And I was talking to Marjorie at lunch, and one of the things, a lot of you might already know this, is that it's pretty conventional in philosophy and logic to say that a rule is an if-then statement. I discovered that like about a month ago. So, I'm not trained in philosophy, and so I just flat out didn't know that, and I was looking in all these different legal writing books for descriptions of like, what is a rule? So the most helpful thing I found, and I'm not saying that this is like canonical or that it's somehow categorically right, but for the problem that I'm trying to solve, which is I'm trying to disaggregate the elements of common law legal reasoning, which is the differentiator between an A exam and a B exam when you're grading issue spotter exams. What I'm trying to do is to disaggregate that into its component elements so that I can provide a specific rubric and students can train on each specific step in the legal reasoning process that as faculty members, this is a thinking fast and thinking slow thing, right? So we're all thinking fast and we can see where we're going and our explanations tend to be incoherent for students, right? Okay, so I'm trying to break it down into a thinking slow, absolutely transparent, completely explicit process. And like I said, it's like if anybody's come across anything that they'd like to recommend, I'd be thrilled because it's, as far as I know, I've bought everything out there in the market, but there may be things I haven't found yet. For example, do people know the book Getting to Maybe? Okay, so what I would say is Getting to Maybe is an example of a book that explicitly tries to address this. And the Getting to Maybe book, I think, is a really fine book, but it's like way too chatty. It's like 300 pages long, and students can't operationalize it at the sentence level. And it's got like way too many things going on. Okay, so the thing that I found was I found it on like eBay and Amazon. If you're a first-year law student and you pay $25 to your Barbary rep, they give you a book called First-Year Law School Success as a token of their gratitude that you've made this preliminary expression of interest to choose Barbary after you graduate from law school, right? They don't say they're selling you the book for $25. So, but the book is not available for sale except as a secondhand book on eBay or Amazon. Okay, so I bought this book, and the person who wrote it is Ira Shafroff, and he teaches at Southwestern in Los Angeles. And this is after I had like gone through, I have gone through at least 20 books on legal writing and like how to succeed in law school exams. And I started reading his book and I thought, yes, Professor Shefferoff and I are like working on the same problem. It was like the sense of relief when I found this book that I wasn't like the only person working at this level of granularity, like sentence by sentence. So this is so Shefferoff has his own little thing. So in a law school exam, the first thing you say is you could write the issue. And this is how Shefferoff tells the students to write the issue. And then you have your legal rule. And then you have your application. And then you have your conclusion. Okay, so now, I have to admit, I've been teaching in the classroom for 25 years, and it's only in the last year or two that I started to focus on this. So, because I always thought, I'm a classroom stand-up lecture teacher, the legal writing people teach this, right? So those of you who know what's really going on will say, oh, but, so I found out it's not true. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like my legal writing instructors don't drill students on IRAC, they don't, right? So I just, all these things that I thought I knew, mistaken impressions I had about what was happening at the law school and how things were being divided up. Okay, so I've recently taken responsibility for teaching my students something equivalent to IRAC, which if you'd say like, gosh, and it took you like 25 years to get there, it's like a sad indictment of legal education. And I thought I was really progressive, and I thought that I was like more user-friendly than other people. Okay, so this is what Shefferoff says. This would be the name of the issue. Okay, so these are the 4 elements that he thinks students should put into their statement of the issue. Okay, so if I create a tutorial, an online tutorial with rubrics where you have a stylized issue spotter and you explain to them that this is what they're supposed to do, and then you give them, now another thing that I'm not sure, and people in this room may know more than I do, whether there's actually any debate, but it seems to me once you've like tortured yourself to write a rubric, I don't understand why you wouldn't give it to the students before they do the work, right?
Oh, you absolutely should.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so this just shows how perverse and dark law school culture is that people think that they shouldn't share their grading criteria with students before the exam. Okay, so it's like, okay, so I'm going to torture myself to come up with a rubric to help students. Do you see what I'm saying? This is where I'm going with this, okay? So I thought when I signed up to give this talk that I would be able to demo one of these lessons for you. Sad to say I don't have the first one operational yet, but I'm still working on it. Okay, so, but does everybody get it? So my idea was at this point, if you've disaggregated the thing going on in the gap here, if you've disaggregated it to this level, and I've got a list of 16 units that, I've drafted some of them and I'm working on some of them, but I have 16 units. And how many people know what Duncan Kennedy was talking about when he talked about flip the holding? Does that resonate for very many people, flip the holding? Okay, so I went here to Harvard Law School in the 80s, and it was like people said that. Okay, so what it means is create your own dissent, right? So you have the same dispute, the same presentation by the plaintiff and the defendant, you have your majority opinion, and then you have a dissent that would say the result should be the opposite, right? So Duncan Kennedy's point, which was part of critical legal studies in the 80s, was you don't need a dissent. If you understand common law legal reasoning, if you've mastered the, shall we say, the radioactive core, chewing nougat, or kernel, right? Then for any given judicial decision, you can generate the opposite result. Now there's cheating ways to do it. One, just like create new facts. No, that's cheating, right? Right? So how would you, if you have any given judicial decision, just download it at random from, Callie has cases, right?
Sure, why not?
We should not refer to proprietary services when
No, there are sponsors.
Okay, so say, for what, you just download a case at random. You should be able to analyze the case, and then by changing the characterization of the facts and changing the phrasing of the rule, with only that, you should be able to get the opposite result. That's flip the holding. Okay? So that's my 16 tutorials That's the final unit. Is here's a case selected at random. What's the minimum number of things you have to change so that you've got an equally well-reasoned outcome that's 180 degrees the opposite? And that my idea is that if students could do that, then you would have an objective basis for saying that they had mastered this, I'll know it when I see it, je ne sais quoi, legal reasoning thing. Okay? So that's where, when I wrote the thing about evidence-based learning, information technology enhancements, what I was thinking was I'm going to create this series of 16 tutorials. They're going to have explicit rubrics. Then they'll have, the assessment part. And then I'm going to, we have Canvas learning management system at University of Washington. Then I'll have the data analytics in Canvas to be able to monitor student performance. That's my presentation. It's a work in progress. So do you see why I said, my goal was that we would have a discussion? Because I'm sure that lots of you have bumped up against things like this in other contexts. No? Yes?
Okay, so at my law school, we have just started developing a rubric, 6 of us who teach seminars for analyzing legal writing. And getting 6 law professors to agree on what constitutes good legal writing broken down into all the component parts is like dying and going to hell.
Okay, now that's, yes, okay, so that raises a separate issue, which is, okay, so my research, in addition to e-commerce, I study the impact of globalization on business. I'm a commercial law professor and I'm studying globalization. And outside of higher education and the bar, when people confront problems like that, how do they achieve closure? Because now at my law school, University of Washington, the legal writing instructors as a collegial body have periodically gotten together and tried to harmonize their rubrics so that, it shouldn't matter which legal writing instructor you have, they should feel confident that they're grading roughly the same way on the memos and stuff. So on a scale of 1 to 10, the legal writing instructors at my law school are at level at least 5 or 6. They've got, loose, general, flexible rubrics that they've gotten together periodically and coordinated on. And the rest of the faculty are down at -1, right? Okay, so once you leave higher education or the legal profession, when you bump up against this problem, which is that people interpret things differently. People have different life experiences, they have different values, and they're coming together and they're trying to achieve consensus, and it's difficult. Outside of these, shall we say, cartels, what's the consequence when people don't achieve consensus and achieve some acceptable, second best solution to the problem? They go bankrupt. Do you see? I don't think the problems that we're grappling with in legal education are categorically different than the problems that anybody's facing anywhere in society. What's different is the governance mechanism, and we are in a cartel. Okay, we're in a double cartel because the legal profession is a cartel and higher education is a cartel, and the legal services bubble has burst, and the cartel in higher education is right on the cusp. So when we start to have painful downsizing in higher education, people are going to discover the basis of compromise, which is the will to survive, right? Do you see what I'm saying? It's the reason that people, I remember from some poem I memorized when I was a child about electrons deify one razor blade into a mountain range, right? How many people have sat in faculty meetings, right? Because there's no consequence. There's no real world consequence for what people are doing. Now, I was on this rant at lunch. I think I ranted at Deb. I don't know if Deb is still here.
I am still here.
Okay, so you listened to this rant again. But did you find the rant about barristers and solicitors helpful?
Yes.
Analyzing the problem about cartels? Okay, so
Yes.
how many people know what's happened to barristers versus solicitors in the UK since Margaret Thatcher reformed the legal profession? Okay, so up until 1979, when Margaret Thatcher became the Prime Minister of the UK, barristers were an inbred, almost quasi-hereditary, high social status group, a very high Oxbridge social elite in the UK. And they're the ones that wear the wigs. When you watch on PBS, you watch the UK crime shows, the people with the wigs are the barristers. Solicitors don't wear wigs, okay? So they wear the robes and they speak in court. So they have a monopoly on speaking in court. So why are solicitors called solicitors? You know, in the United States, you have those signs that says solicitors prohibited? Okay, barristers were prohibited from looking for clients. So they had this symbiotic relationship with the solicitors. The solicitors were going out encouraging people to litigate, and then they would refer the files to the barristers because the barristers weren't allowed to encourage people to litigate, okay? So until recently, until I think even just like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the solicitor, when they went into court, walked behind the barrister and carried the books, right? So you get it's like categorically inferior, okay? So, the small number of barristers had both social prestige and high income, and some solicitors earned good money. Solicitors in the UK have no monopoly. It's 100% free market. If you want to pay somebody who's not a solicitor to draft a contract, it's fine. So solicitors in the UK are very pragmatic and very client value oriented. So some solicitors earned good money even before the Thatcher reforms. The big law firms in the City of London were all solicitors. But in general, they were still that hard. So Margaret Thatcher just opened the floodgates. She just made it possible for anyone and everyone to become a barrister. So of course, this pent-up demand among solicitors who always longed to be barristers, there's this like huge in-migration, and the income of barristers collapsed. And many barristers now turn in their admission to the bar and they go back to being solicitors because they can't earn a living as barristers. So there's a small number, an inner circle of barristers that are members of the elite. They're called like QC, Queen's Counsel. And they have high social status and earn terrible tons of money. But in general, the average income for barristers in the UK is lower than the average income for solicitors. So do you see what the point of this horror story is American attorneys are like, historically they were more like the solicitors because they were pragmatic and open-minded about developing new lines of law practice and being engaged with society and doing things. But as lawyers get more and more focused on defending their monopoly and their cartel status, they're being disintermediated. So I think that what I'm doing here has an analog in law practice, that elements of law practice need to be disaggregated with task analysis the same way, so that you can start to collect data and track performance and make comparisons. And lawyers have been profoundly resistant to this, and I think it's because, one, it's really a hard slog, let me tell you, and two, they have a conflict of interest. Right? Because they think the easiest way for them to maintain their standard of living is to defend their cartel and insist that all this stuff has to be bespoke. It all has to be, you know, the process of subjective, you know, undocumentable brain processes. Okay? So anyway, so I think there's the problem exists on two levels. There's a similar analogous problem in the legal profession where people are just like flat out in denial about the need to leverage information technology more effectively. Since I'm on this rant, I'll just go ahead and mention. If I had to guess what the legal profession would have to look like in 25 years in order to maintain its current social status and income, my guess is they have to get ahead of the curve and they have to become intermediaries facilitating the public's access to new technology. That anything less, they're going to be left in the dust. So we haven't met, but we agree. Okay, so does that make sense?
Absolutely.
That as long, how many people saw there was like a blog or an article or something called Lawyer versus Machine? As long as you set up the problem that way, lawyers will lose. They will, over the long term, end up like the barristers in the UK, right? So, okay, so there is an end game where lawyers they can embrace technology. It's like progressive insurance. They can say, I can offer you this service, there's this software product, there's this, you know, peer-to-peer product, and here are the strengths and weaknesses of each, and then let people make up their own minds. And if lawyers do that, then they'll retain their status as intermediary. And if they say, that's bad and I'm good, and I'm completely unaccountable and I refuse to be transparent about the service I'm providing, then we can predict how that's going to work out. Okay, so I think the same problem exists in law school and in the legal profession. And so what I'm trying to do is to make it possible to start collecting a lot of data about how students learn and then start the continuous improvement process. Now, how would you do that? So I've already pointed out that when you leave higher education or the legal profession, the problems that people are grappling with are just as painful and just as hard, and they're making decisions under just as much uncertainty, but because they are afraid of the financial consequences of failing to achieve closure and to do something constructive, then they find a way to get over that. And in higher education, we don't, right? We just, yes?
Well, I was just going to say, I think where you start is with learning outcomes, which I think you got there. I mean, defining that radioactive core, you have to decide, so what do you want your students to know and be able to do? And generally you start with a really big picture analysis. So what you want your students to do is you want them to understand torts, right?
Now,
but then you have to drill it down to a level that is specific enough that you can then write assessments that directly get at those learning outcomes. And where the rubrics come in is for your when you're testing complex abilities. So writing, speaking, if you're doing trial advocacy and that kind of thing, you're going to have all of those specific learning outcomes plus some layer of assigned grade, 1, 2, 3, 4 for
Oh, sure. But like I said, I've been working with those templates. I know how to fill in the templates. It's just that the people who knew what a well-drafted rubric looked like just didn't like what I was putting in them. You see what I mean? Is that stylistically I was putting descriptions of learning outcomes in the rubric instead of how you assess different student results. What I was going to say was at the end of that rant is okay, if market discipline sometimes can be a healthy astringent that kills mold, right? What would be the outcome that you would expect in higher education? Abolition of tenure. Okay, so now you know where I'm coming from. Okay. Until you abolish tenure, I don't think, for most faculty members, I don't think people are not going to constructively engage, and they will not be willing to compromise with a view to maximizing the value to students. That tenure creates noise and it makes it impossible for faculty members to puzzle through the hard issues. Does that make sense? That's my personal belief. Okay. You feel puzzled by mine.
I'm not puzzled. I think in our case, we've become accredited by the Western Association of Schools and Colleges in the last 2 years, and they are very focused on outcomes-based education and assessment. And so the faculty deeply resents the word accreditation. So you don't use that word, but you nonetheless do the things that you got to do to remain accredited.
Okay, so then what I would say is, it sounds like that's, okay, and again, there's buzzwords, because you can say that the accreditation people want to see like these outcome assessments, and we can do it like we did in Australia, which is we can cut and paste, and then I can cut and paste in the results, and I can say everybody did great. And then when the auditors come, the bean counters, you can show them that you've documented that you had these rubrics and that you applied them, and that the result, you see what I mean? So yeah, so there's a problem, which is that if it's external to the actual faculty, there's ways that faculties can comply in form, but not in substance. But now, what I was going to say is, like, what's the opposite of tacit? Because in that phrase there, the osmotic transmission of tacit knowledge, what's the opposite of tacit? Explicit? Explicit? Okay. Explicit. Okay. Okay, so, and then here in the center is the radioactive core. Okay. So John Mayer and I were debating this. So John Mayer's background is in computer science. So we hypothesized that, and Deb and I were talking, and we were thinking that this might be kinesthetic, sort of learning by doing, right? That there's an element of legal reasoning that you have. It's like learning to play a musical instrument or dancing. You actually don't know whether you're engaging in legal reasoning until you've actually gotten up on stage and tried to do it and been told that wasn't right, and right? So there's a sort of tacit and kinesthetic element here to the core. The gap has a different quality than the thing. We have relatively well-developed rubrics and learning outcomes for the background knowledge part. Does that make sense? We're making pretty good progress, and the commercial study aids in law are actually quite good at this, right? So John and I were just hypothesizing that outside of legal education, across higher education, K-12 education, whatever, is that the explicit, formal, direct, transparent transmission of knowledge and information, that might account for like 70% of the content of instruction, and then this core might be like 30%. John was talking about learning to program computers, or we could analogize to learning to play a musical instrument, or we could analogize to any of the other sort of higher function things. You know, what are you supposed to get from a bachelor's degree? You're supposed to learn to think critically. Okay, so this is where you learn, you know, the dates of Napoleon's victories in Europe, and then this is where you learn to think critically, right? So it's in terms of my description, is everybody on board for what I'm describing here? Okay, so we just made this up. You know, whenever I don't know actual statistics, I just make them up, right? So we just said, across higher education generally, let's just hypothesize that roughly 70% of the outcomes, the learning outcomes that we're trying to assess, are relatively transparent, explicit, straightforward, right? And that there's this, in every subject, there's that core, which is the difference between mastery and reading Wikipedia, right? Okay, so if that's what we said for across whatever, what do people in this room who work in legal education think the relative proportions would be for law? Do you think it's 30-70, or do you think it's different? Especially, let's focus on the first year JD curriculum. I'd say for the 2 and 3L curriculum, this is a fair assessment. The 2 and 3L curriculum in law school is roughly congruent in terms of concrete, transparent, direct. What do you think? People say, like, I don't even get the question.
90-10.
90-10? You're trying to be controversial.
First year
90%?
It's all doctrine.
Oh, yes.
Oh, you think in first year law school?
Since I'm not a lawyer or not going to law school, I'll
Okay, so
I'll
John is guessing lower. I actually think,
Higher.
no. Oh, okay. So, no. What you've just highlighted is that this part, the explicit part, is denser. There's more crud to wade through.
Okay.
So, okay. So there's a lot of content, but in turn, what I'm talking about is at the end of the learning process, the relative weights of what you're trying to assess. So when you're reading issue spotter exams, so we all know bad people who aren't in this room, read issue spotter exams and just mark a letter grade with no contents because they can evaluate the quality of IRAC answers, right? We all know that. Do we know that or not? The bad classroom teachers that have a lot of blue books to read grade highly subjectively and very, very fast, right? Okay, so that's what I'm taking as my hypothetical. It's like you're a first year professor, you've taught criminal law or civil procedure or torts or contracts or property, and you're reading a pile of blue books, and how much of what you're assessing is, did they learn the model penal code, and did they learn about appellate versus, first instance, right? Because you see, I would say in legal education for that first year JD curriculum, I would just reverse the percentages. I'd say 70% is tacit. Because if we're doing the Socratic method instead of lecture, like what's that about? I mean, the Socratic method is still widely used in the first year curriculum, right? So there's a question which is like, why do we still, in the 21st century, why do we still use, in the second and third year, the use of Socratic method drops way off, right? Do people agree? I think that's a convention, right? Okay, so why do we think it's so important to have, so this 30% is incredibly dense. What's the densest thing in the world? Kryptonite, right? I don't know.
Neutronium.
What?
Neutronium.
Neutronium, okay, so law school is neutronium. And English is cotton, right? Soft and comforting. Okay, so law school is just incredibly dense. The formal, specific, explicit. Okay, the other thing I forgot to draw Bloom's taxonomy. Okay, so this is like you know it, right? You understand it. You can apply it. You can evaluate it, and then you can be creative. Okay, there's other ways to do Bloom's taxonomy. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? This is the incredibly simplified from memory version. Okay, so this part corresponds to this, the base, and this part, the radioactive core is like this, right? The difference between like summa cum laude and cum laude or not, right? That's creative, okay? So that's the radioactive core there. So what I would say is that in legal education, there's a lot of that being transmitted in the Socratic method. I think the reason the Socratic method has endured for over a century is it is without regard to what Langdell thought he was doing, it is a remarkably effective method for pushing students to confront this. But it's all tacit, yes?
Just to tie it back into, so it's evidence-based.
Mm-hmm.
So how are you, so how are you doing the rubric to bring you back to the data that you're meeting an outcome of this core?
This is what it's I think what's been missing. Okay, so I think that there's always going to be an irreducible element where you're going to have to make dramatic gestures and raise your voice and confront students emotionally to get them to make that final jump. But what I'm suggesting is that we could reduce a lot of the tacit transmission, the osmotic transmission of tacit knowledge in the first year curriculum. We could get closer to the 70-30 that everyone else has if we started doing like task analysis and trying to break it down into a learning progression. But what I'm saying is that it has to be focused on thinking like a lawyer, disaggregating thinking like a lawyer. So if you thought it was tough to come up with a rubric for the first memo in legal writing, can you imagine what pandemonium would break out if you tried to get law faculty to agree on thinking like a lawyer rubrics? That's what I've been struggling with all this year. I take my thinking like a lawyer rubrics over to the Center for Teaching and Learning and they say, I've learned so much about law from talking, but it's not a rubric. Do you see the problem? Is that until you've got a more granular, concrete description of the stuff that's in the tacit part, we have to pull things out of the tacit part and make them explicit, is what I'm arguing. Okay? And I'm suggesting it's just not rocket science. I mean, I'm doing it because I'm a particularly perverse and ambitious person, right? But I don't think it's fundamentally difficult. And I think there's several things going on. One is there is an element of transmission of legal culture. It's like hazing. Like first year Socratic method is like hazing, and everybody who survives it says that it was fine. Right? Yeah, they all close ranks, right? The other thought I've had about the first year JD curriculum is, some of you may know a lot more about medicine than I do, but there's a tradition in the United States that internists have like these bizarre things like 36 hours on, 24 hours off.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and why would that be? Because we really don't care if they kill people? Like, why would that be?
It's supposed to teach them the ability to make snap decisions under pressure.
Yeah, I think that's very similar to what we're doing in the first year JD curriculum, to the extent that you're doing like Kingsfield, paper chase, humiliate people, ask incredibly cryptic Socratic method questions. You're achieving something like that same level of stress so that when people can perform, they can perform under stress. So there's a sort of rite of passage, being socialized into the tribe, like secret handshake kind of thing. So I understand that because like this is a very friendly and supportive audience. Like so far no one has just told me that I'm a complete cretin and this is stupid, right? But I mean, in general, when I mention this to my colleagues, it's like, just like how pathetic and ridiculous that you would even try to do that. It's like what I'm doing is like beneath contempt, right? Which is like, that's an interesting reaction, isn't it? That's a data point. Do you see what I'm saying? Is that because this is a friendly audience, group of colleagues, we're sort of engaging with the issues. But like when I try and engage with these issues with people selected randomly in legal education, this is where you bump up against the socialization. It's like, no, this is the way it has to be. And they're going to put their foot on the accelerator and they're going to drive off that cliff. because the economics are changing in the background. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like we're running out of time to say, we're going to do a cost-benefit analysis, and there's a certain benefit in society to all lawyers knowing the secret handshake, right? It builds solidarity among members of the profession. It's a shared culture, all that kind of thing, right? There's values.
It's a guild.
Pardon? It's a guild. Yes, right. So there's benefits to the sort of tacit social customization, socialization process that happens in the law school curriculum. And if I'm successful, that's going to fall, right? Because it's going to become like first-year chemistry, undergraduates. Do people know about POGIL and first-year chemistry, what they've done with first-year chemistry? I have a colleague at UW Law School who rants and raves about POGIL the way I rant and rave about this. So, I don't know, 20 years ago, they studied, the President's Academy on diversity in higher education or something, discovered that hardly any women and minorities were making it into medical school. And so they did their big study and they said, it's that organic chemistry class. How many people knew that the whole point of organic chemistry is to convince people they need to major in something else? Right? I mean, it has been run that way. That was the point. It's like we can't have 80% of all undergraduates at this university becoming doctors. It's not going to work, right? So they said, okay, so that's one way to approach organic chemistry. There's costs and benefits to doing it because most people they're never going to survive in medical school, and the sooner they figure that out and choose a different major, the better for them personally. So there's benefits to making organic chemistry horrific for most students, right? So anyway, so they changed it. And now, because they have this POGIL, which is, I can't remember it's POGL, I can't remember what that stands for, but POGIL, they've gotten to where 80 or 90% of people can pass organic chemistry now. So now you have a much broader and more diverse population of people who are eligible to attend medical school, okay? So all I'm saying is that they've made the decision in chemistry, undergraduate, that they want 90% success rates. And they've completely rebuilt the entire chemistry curriculum. So why haven't we rebuilt the JD first year curriculum? Because it's a cartel. The point is to exclude people. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like, I think when people say it's like, you can't teach legal reasoning the same way they teach organic chemistry. It's like, no. You would prefer that we not teach legal reasoning. It's not that legal reasoning can't be taught the way they teach organic chemistry now. It is capable of being taught that way.
What's the role in all of this of the Gladwell notion that just quantity of practice builds expertise?
10,000 hours.
Yeah, that's what I would say. If law schools standardized, and I would say even the second and third year law, like 80 or 90% of students after they've had an entire academic year at our university, it's quarters, but most universities it's semesters, so they've had 5 mandatory courses times 2 semesters or 3 quarters or whatever. 80 or 90% of students are kind of sort of in the ballpark, and then you shift to them. So we've got that. I mean, what I would say is
But what I'm saying is if Gladwell's right and that's a necessary precursor, is this kind of analysis actually going to move us faster into that level of competence?
Okay, so I have to admit, I've read some
I'm with
things,
you
right.
in terms of the desirability of making this overt, but I'm not necessarily sure I'm with you in terms of this is going to make the profession function more...
Okay, so that goes back to the Plan, Do, Check, Act, continuous improvement kind of thing, right? Which is, so say hypothetically we launch this, right? So we start disaggregating and teaching at a much, much, much more granular level the elements of common law legal reasoning. So I had a colleague at University of Washington. His name is Wallace Lowe, and he's now the president of the University of Maryland, proving that he was even more talented than anyone at UW thought. Okay, so I have a colleague who lives in Seattle who had him when he was a first-year contracts teacher. And in first-year contracts, whenever students would ask a question, he'd say, I'm not going to address that right now, but on February 23rd, all will become clear. So the entire first academic, because it's 2 terms, right? Okay, so, questions and comments, it's check back with me on February 23rd. So on February 23rd, all the students came and one of them raised their hand and said, Professor Lowe, it didn't work. And he said, I know, I lied. But actually, those of us who teach in the classroom in the first year, we know he actually wasn't lying. sometime around 6 months, the dominoes begin to fall and the fog begins to lift, and most students get most of the stuff they're supposed to get. So what I would say is my goal is to shift that inflection point from mid-February to mid-November.
Right, and what I'm asking is that doable if part of the development of that expertise is repeated iteration?
Okay, so this goes back to what I was gonna say, which is like, I would say the problem we have in legal education is we start out at advanced beginner and then we go to intermediate.
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole JD curriculum, right? It's got 2 steps. Too hard in the beginning, too easy at the end, right?
Mhm.
It's like every other subject proceeds in a progression. So if we could take this advanced beginner thing and break it down into beginner, advanced beginner, intermediate over the course of the first year, then you could reorganize the second and third year curriculum to be much more effective by using the same evidence-based methods. So what I'm saying is, like, I'm not saying anything about whether law school should be 2 years or 3 years or how much time it takes. What I'm saying is that you've got seats and chairs, and if they can get up to speed and not feel confused faster, then that releases time and psychological energy so that when they graduate, they could have more well-rounded skills. Because the students that we're graduating, we still have what's the feedback from law firms? It's like they're still not competent, right? Okay, so say hypothetically, instead of having the 2-step curriculum that we have, if we were able to do this, then this is the payoff right there. Is that if it really proceeds incrementally and you keep it at the 3 years, and we test and test and test, and we can really say, this is the stuff you need to be doing. How many people saw Justice Scalia's address at William and Mary? Oh, it's hilarious. You need to type, Antonin Scalia, William and Mary, commencement address, 2014. It's hilarious. So he actually got somebody to dig up archival copies at Harvard Law School of his curriculum when he was a JD. And it literally takes him several paragraphs in the commencement address to describe all the mandatory courses in his Harvard Law School JD degree in whatever that was, in the late 60s, early 70s. Okay? So then we could actually, instead of saying it's like fine for you to do legal issues of experimental basket weaving, that's equivalent to trial ad, right? Which is what we have to say now, is we could say the mandatory first year curriculum starts out with super basic stuff. By the end of the first year curriculum, you would be able to have the same kind of discussions you can have with second and third year students now. And then in the course of the second year, here's a mandatory progression of courses. These are all required. And then here in the third year, we have like a structured sequence of experiential learning that turns out practice-ready students. And we still got the same law school faculty, and we still got the same tuition structure. And in fact, students can earn more money and, provide better service and discover unmet legal needs in the market and new revenue sources. You see, it's like world peace.
Unattainable.
Pardon?
You mean unattainable?
Oh. But, yes.
So just so I understand, you're not there yet. You're not. So
That's
you're
right.
saying this is
Do you want to
the
hear
issue.
the deliverable? Do you want to hear the deliverable?
Yes.
I've gotten myself signed up, and University of Washington starts, it's on quarters, we start in September. I'm teaching as an overload a 2-credit undergraduate course, which is pass-fail for the undergraduates, and I'm going to take a maximum of 20 students, and the seminar is organized so that everybody gets together for one session. And I'm going to have, if we have a 10-week academic term, I'll have 10 cases, and I'm finding basic contract cases that start out with mutual manifestation of assent, what is an offer, what is an acceptance, and what is consideration. That's it. It's a truncated syllabus, and none of the cases in the first year casebooks. None of them. It's all modern in the last 10, 20 years, and these cases are like between 1,000 and 2,000 words long. So undergraduates with their Black's Law Dictionary can read them and understand them because they're like about people arguing about used cars, right? Okay, so they're going to have a little reader in the 20-student combined large session, and we're going to read individual cases. And then I'm going to have a control group and the experimental group. And the experimental group gets my 16 tutorials, and at the end they should know how to flip a case. And the other group I'm going to give, you can tell me whether you think this is a good idea, I'm going to buy the examples and explanations for contract law is currently in its 6th edition. I'm gonna buy copies on Amazon of the 5th edition, because it doesn't matter, right? It's like, let me tell you how much it would have cost per page to photocopy the relevant sections. So I'm just gonna buy used copies of the 5th edition of Examples and Explanations, because I personally think that the Examples and Explanations books do the best of all the commercial study aids of getting students in this direction, right? The other commercial study aids are starting to mimic that style. So I'm gonna buy, the control group is gonna get Examples and Explanations, and we're gonna read Mutual Manifestation of Assent, Offer and Acceptance and Consideration, put the book in, right? So that's what they're gonna get. My experimental group is gonna have these online tutorials in Canvas, and we'll talk about them in the class with the experimental group. And at the end, they're gonna have 2 very short bar type issue spotters. So they're gonna, the question is, if I can get students, undergraduate students who are taking no other law school classes in one elective 2-credit seminar, and then I'm gonna give all the exam results to a colleague. I have to strong arm a colleague into grading all 20 exams, because I can't read the exams. I would be able to tell which section they were in, right? So I'm going to write a detailed answer key, give it to a colleague, and have a colleague mark the exams. And we'll see, it's like, I think it's entirely possible, because I am a business law professor and I do think the free market works well, sometimes at least. It is possible that the Examples and Explanations will work better than my tutorials. I think it's a fair test. I mean, I've put my heart and soul into my little 16 tutorials, but, you know, some of you have already figured out that I'm completely misguided, right? So do you see what I'm saying? So that's, and then, so let's just say hypothetically that we get to the end of the 2-credit course and they're supposed to do issue spotters, because one of the things, I don't know if you focused on this, in undergraduate education in the United States, how many different law courses are taught around the university? Business law courses are taught in business schools, in communication departments, they have media law, in sociology they have like criminal law for criminal justice majors, right? What's the difference between an undergraduate exam in the business law course or the media law course or the criminal justice course? They describe what the law is, they don't spot issues. That's the acid test. The difference between, has anybody had non-law students in law school? They can't spot issues, that's the acid test, right? Okay, so if I can get them so that they're even like remotely approaching spotting issues and they have no other information about IRAC except what I've given them, then I think and I'm going to have the analytics, I'm going to make both sections take quizzes in Catalyst, so I'll have analytics about how their thinking is developing over the academic term. I think I could argue that the first year curriculum could be radically overhauled. If we systematically applied that kind of, testing empirically. Let's brainstorm about how you could test empirically. So with my colleagues, the legal writing instructors, in my first year contracts class, I'm going to give Brian Garner's legal writing in addition to the textbook, and have exercises to practice legal writing. Because for the first time last year, I gave students a bunch of homework and I was appalled. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have to work on that. Okay, so I'm going to give them Brian Garner. So some of my legal writing colleagues said, oh, we give Brian Garner. So what if you had, as an experiment, you would have, I have my first year contracts, and legal writing instructor 1 gives Brian Garner, I give Brian Garner, and then I have another colleague where they have no Brian Garner, right? Or they could have Brian Garner here, right? Okay, so you would have 4 different groups. You would have students that have no exposure to Brian Garner. You would have students that only get it in legal writing. You would have, oh, wait a minute. These people have 2, they have 1. Yeah, so you get 3 then, I guess. 3 different combinations. So, oh no, wait a minute, these people have Brian Garner, but no, right, so that's the 4 combinations, right? Okay, so you could test, right? So you could write a test at the end, it wouldn't have anything to do with students' grades. You could test my first year contract students, my peers' first year contract students, and see how many people have a suspicion that the students that were forced to read Brian Garner's handbook on better legal writing in both legal writing and first year contracts would probably have statistically significant better legal writing. How many people think that's the probable outcome of this experiment? Right? And we're not doing it! Is anybody doing this in legal education today? No, because faculty members say, like, I am the king of my classroom kingdom, and I will not tolerate any interference with my academic freedom, because they can't be fired. Okay. Okay, so So how many people feel surprised that this session turned out the way it did? Yeah.
So, just a side question. I've talked to other faculty where I am about this notion that actually the problem with first year is that we